get started. Sorry we've had so much technological problems, but some of us are a little bit challenged in that area. It's a real pleasure for me to greet all of you this late afternoon for our first presentation of an exhibit that we're having from now until early March at the Nabb Center. So I hope that you will enjoy not only tonight's speaker, but the reception and the opening of the exhibit following that at the Nabb Center. So we're on both campuses, on main campus and back on East Campus afterwards. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to say just a little bit about the exhibit. As many of you are probably aware, the Lincoln and the Constitution exhibit came to the Nabb Center as a result of a grant we wrote nearly 3 years ago when we first heard about the Lincoln and the Constitution exhibit. That exhibit was initially created as a display in Philadelphia and was organized by the National Constitution Center in the American Library Association Public Programs Office. That exhibit then led to the creation of a traveling exhibition made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The Lincoln exhibit seemed, at the time, to be an ideal exhibit for us that we could easily connect and complement an exhibit that we were planning of our own at the Nabb Center, an exhibit on the Eastern Shore's involvement in the Civil War. We already planned for that to be planned in one of our galleries, so having this exhibit to go along with it seemed like it was a perfect complement. We applied to be one of the host sites and were fortunate enough to be chosen as the site for the Lower Eastern Shore of Delmarva. And as a part of the grant, each host site is mandated to have 2 presentations and a reception. And that brings us to tonight's events. It was a no-brainer for us to determine that we wanted Dr. Kellee Green Blake as our keynote speaker for the opening of our exhibit. Kellee is an expert on Lincoln. She's an expert on the Constitution and on the Civil War. She is a thorough researcher and a spellbinding speaker. Many of you have heard her. So who would be better for us to have open our exhibit? Dr. Blake is a retired director of the National Archives Mid-Atlantic region in Philadelphia. She was initiated into Phi Beta Kappa, the most prestigious academic honor society of colleges and universities. She graduated summa cum laude from Mary Washington College and received her graduate degree in U.S. history from Villanova University, where she was awarded the Daniel Carroll Prize for Graduate Writing. Her PhD in history is from the University of Pennsylvania. In her work at the National Archives, she has administered papers from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, including the papers of Abraham Lincoln, the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, and the Lincoln Pardon. Dr. Blake has been a much sought-after speaker at national genealogical and historical conferences and is the author of more than 30 articles and guides from the federal census, federal records of all sorts of the Civil War era, and historical court records as well. Among her various publications relating to Lincoln, Loyalty, and Liberty is an intriguing article entitled 10 Firkins of Butter and Other Traitorous Aid: Disloyalty Prosecutions in the Federal Civil Courts, 1861 to 1865. Other publications are Aiding and Abetting, Disloyalty Prosecutions in the Federal Civil Courts of Southern Illinois, 1861-65, and Lincoln's Legal Legacy, Educational and Public Programs. She is also the author of Lincoln at the Bar, Interpretations of Abraham Lincoln in the Federal and State Courts in Illinois. In 1994, her careful and thorough study of the Lincoln Papers led to her being granted the Lincoln Legal Eagle Award for her identification of Lincoln legal annotations on ordinary court records. For us, what is most important is that since 2007, Dr. Blake, who coincidentally happens to be a frequent researcher at the Nabb Center, has been preparing a comprehensive monograph on the federal occupation of Virginia's Eastern Shore, an area known for its fiercely divided loyalties. Dr. Blake is much in demand as a speaker, having shared her expertise with numerous historical organizations throughout the tri-state area and as far west as Missouri. Many of you will want to hear her upcoming presentation on Stronger Than Steel, Voices of Shore Women, 1861 to 1865, which will be presented in an Hancock later this semester. But tonight she'll speak on the right spirit, Lincoln, loyalty, and liberties on the Eastern Shore, 1861 to 1865. If you think Lincoln and the wartime leaders cared little about what happened on the Eastern Shore, listen carefully to what our speaker has to say. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Blake.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thompson. Can everyone hear me? Is everyone able to hear me? Yikes, my gosh, I wish my mom had heard that. And I must say, I don't have my PhD, but it sure sounded good. So I'm much encouraged to go get one after that introduction. Thank you all for coming out this evening, and I hope that you will not leave the way you walked into this building in your feelings about the Eastern Shore of Maryland and this war. So speaking of memory and the Eastern Shore, let me tell you a tale of an Eastern shoreman who some 30 years after the Civil War was bragging about his Confederate service to a cub reporter in Washington, D.C. And when asked what he'd done, the Confederate gentleman said, "I remember that we took on a lot of bean eaters from Boston and Germans from Pennsylvania, and we killed so many of the invaders that a large portion of the county of Accomack was made so fertile from their carcasses that if you'd planted crowbars in that soil, 10 penny nails would sprout up the next morning." And we know that's a tall tale, but I assure you it is no more grievous in its error than this, or the one I most loathe, this, that nothing really happened here during the Civil War. And folks, whether you are Lincoln lovers or Lincoln loathers, and there have been both since there was an Abraham Lincoln, you must agree that there is a voracious appetite for information about Abraham Lincoln. It never stops, and it never seems satisfied, because it seems the more we know about the man, the more we wish to know. Was he simply a country lawyer, never an executive, with no idea of the way to implement the United States Constitution? Was he cavalier? As this writing, in fact, what you're seeing is what I found in the Josiah Grindal case. It seems cavalier the way Lincoln would express his constitutional idea on what should happen to Grindal. Or was he a focused politician who full well understood the national tragedy before him and carefully weighed his decision-making in just how much of the Constitution could be applied or suspended to keep the nation in one piece? And I know you're going to enjoy this about this exhibit over at the Nabb Center. You will certainly see the difficult choices he needed to make on the national level. But I want you to know that Abraham Lincoln cared very much what was happening here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and the Eastern Shore of Virginia. In fact, my research for the last, I'm not going to tell you how many years, has been about the Eastern Shore of Virginia. I was so compelled by some records I found of blockade running, I determined there was a story here that needed to be told. And in so doing, you can't help but see all of the activity happening on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. They are not two separate states on the map, as you well know. And Abraham Lincoln had his eye on this area because much was happening here. Much that we don't know about, much that's not captured in the so-called official records of the Union and Confederate armies and navies, although Eastern Shore is mentioned, and it's this Eastern Shore, the shores, nearly 1,000 times. But the home front is a front, and this was a home front. And I say, when everyone gets weary of looking at Gettysburg for the millionth time, and to the point where now we're getting dissertations about what kind of food was served to the cavalry horses at Gettysburg, and sorry if that's your dissertation title, but I think it's time for us to move our attentions to the home front. There are remarkable stories that simply await the telling, just like these. These are records about Virginia's Eastern Shore that I found several years ago at the National Archives, still tied up in their red tape. And I would be untrue if I said there weren't countless other boxes in repositories, not the Nabb Center, but in repositories from north to south and east to west that tell the story of the Eastern Shore in the Civil War. Now we know that April of 1861 was a cascading series of events that shook the foundation of the nation. First, the firing on Fort Sumter. We definitely have a state of insurrection, a belligerent action has occurred. Shortly thereafter, Virginia seceded, and right after that, Lincoln proclaimed that there would be a blockade of the southern ports. And by using the term blockade, as much as Lincoln may have hoped to mince around the business of whether the Confederate States of America were a legitimate body, the word blockade recognized some level of foreign nation and some level of belligerency that needed to be handled in a particular way. And the reason we will care right away on the Eastern Shores is the long-standing socioeconomic arrangements between families in trade, in transport, between the Eastern Shores of Maryland and Virginia and the Eastern and Western Shores hit a bump in the road because something has happened to make these shores have a schism, and that is the secession of Virginia. Virginia, including the two counties of Accomack and Northampton, are part of the blockade. The Eastern Shore of Maryland is not, because although there may be a strong feeling that it will secede, it has not yet. And this immediately affects the rights and privileges of folks on the Eastern Shore. And I thank the Unitarians of Delmarva for the crispest map I found indicating the three states, the three states that are represented on the Delmarva Peninsula. The idea for blockade was called the Anaconda Plan, was General Winfield Scott believed and presented the concept of choking the Confederacy, disallowing anything to reach the ports, and in so doing, there would be no way, knowing the production of the Confederacy, that it could sustain itself. From the outset, it was a bold plan, but take a look at the Delmarva Peninsula and the proximity to Richmond. The incalculable miles of waterways, the creeks, the inlets, the guts, and a federal navy ill-prepared to monitor any such landscape, and watermen who had done it all of their lives. I will argue in my book that the blockade of the Chesapeake Bay regarding the Eastern Shores was only at the outset successful, and that is because, like someone who's been told there's poison in the water, at the outset of blockade, folks simply were convinced that there were more gunboats on the bay than truly they found to be. But once they dared across, they never stopped. And the federal government was ill-prepared to implement this blockade. It was so poorly administered on the Chesapeake Bay that the few cases that we have of prize and blockade running are small peanuts compared to the amount of material that really managed to get across. And this is a classic example of the scoffing that the nation did for the administration of the blockade. The tub on the right is a Union blockade vessel that tells the tub in the back, a Confederate vessel, stop, you must stop, because we've been given orders to drop anchor and write to the Secretary of War for further instructions on what you should do. I think they're so effective, these watermen, not in the big blockade running vessels you see in magazines, in canoes, in these wooden canoes and small skiffs with sails painted black, with skills on changing the name of their vessel, getting false documents, making arrangements, the Virginians making arrangements to have their vessel, their goods sailed out of Maryland. There were just an endless number of constantly changing and creative efforts to run the blockade. And I think they are like the no-see-em fleet. You've heard of the mosquito fleet. But like a no-see-em, they boom, did their sting, and before the federal government could catch up with them, they were gone, disappeared into the night and into the streams and guts they knew. Now, the three main runnings for the blockade are from the eastern shore of Maryland, through the islands, and into the northern neck, and then from Accomack County into Matthews County, and then from Northampton County, literally from here to here, is 23 miles and can be seen on a clear day. If the Chesapeake Bay were paved, these would literally be aqua highways. So well known were these routes. So well followed were these routes, almost like a train schedule. And we know that because a Pinkerton detective was hired to surreptitiously go through the blockade. And even with all the information he provided, they still were not able to make many arrests for the blockade runner. However, one of the challenges of capturing blockade runners was the purpose of their running. Much was for patriotism. And we see a perpetual demand from the Confederacy, and I mean the top of the Confederacy. This is Robert E. Lee specifically requesting that the men of Maryland, meaning the Eastern Shore, and Accomack, which is the overarching term for the Eastern Shore of Virginia, keep it coming. Keep these goods coming. Well, when they were captured by the federal government on their way, they were prosecuted. Not so much the blockade runner, but the goods themselves. Because at the outset of war, and certainly through the summer of 1861, there was one prosecution on the books for disloyalty, and it was treason. And the only punishment for treason was death by hanging, made difficult and limited by the Constitution itself, nevertheless, the only charge. And it became clear that the entire Confederacy could not be hanged, and more than that, grandmoms knitting socks for their Confederate boys could not be hanged. And the federal government, through 2 confiscation acts, determined they would not prosecute grandmom, they would prosecute the socks, the thing. They would make the prosecution against the thing. Any property found in a disloyal situation could be prosecuted under the Confiscation Acts. And that meant, very important to folks on the Eastern Shore, your human property. If federal officers could demonstrate that this human being had been used to build fortifications, or, as oft happened on the Eastern Shore, been sent to run the blockade so that their owner would not be prosecuted, they could be confiscated under the Acts of 61 and 62. So now, war is on the table, and it's the summer of 1861, and you needed to take a good look at your neighbors and see if you trusted them, because everything about your loyalties will affect your following year. It was different in the 19th century on the Eastern Shore and neighborhoods. Folks typically knew the beliefs of their neighbor, in part because the voting was viva voce, by voice, so you stated your vote in front of your community. And if not that, the way the balloting was done, the slips that you had for a particular candidate were very distinguishable from others. So you would take it up to the box and it would have a big red band at the end. Everyone knew for whom you were voting. And this is the summer where Dr. Thompson has a very nice looking boat. I've always wanted it, you know, and I think I saw him sending that southward with some goods, say I, to the local marshal, and he will confiscate, on my word, Dr. Thompson's vessel and give me first chance to purchase it. And by the time Dr. Thompson figures out what's happening and can in any court make claim for his vessel, it may be long after the war is over and his vessel has been captured and recaptured during the course of the war. And so, if any of you have ever read the book Entertaining Satan, it's by John Demos. It's about the Salem witch trials and the the neighborhood dynamics of who will accuse whom based upon their previous relationships. I see this very much throughout all the border states in this business of confiscation. The other thing that thankfully makes for great records, I have to say, is Abraham Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Now, as you'll see in the exhibit over at the Nabb Center, the Constitution does permit that when there is a state of insurrection. But because everyone is mincing around the term of the Confederacy, when Lincoln chooses to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in May of 1861 in Baltimore, it is a source of great outcry. Those who have no idea of the way this war will unfold and believe it will be a short war think this is going to be the beginning of the end of the nation as we know it constitutionally. And I will say, Ex parte Merriman, the precedent case for the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, and by the way, that means your legal authority to demand the body of someone in custody and have that body brought to you. It's suspended. So if you are arrested by the military here in Salisbury and the judge says, I think these are false charges, I want you to bring this individual before me so I can hear their side of the story, no go. With the suspension of the writ, that was not required. Ex parte Merriman, Ex parte Vallandigham, Ex parte Milligan are all cases that will occur during the Civil War that won't be resolved until well after the war and still are brought as precedent today, because there's almost nothing, folks, that I'm speaking of this evening that you can't make a contemporary conversation about, whether it be free speech, the rights of individuals, the right to be heard by a civil court or a military court. These are rights that we're still discussing in this evening's news. Abraham Lincoln walked a tightrope with the border states the entire war, trying to balance conciliation and firmness. His willingness to be fair judge, but wanting what he wanted very much. And that's one of the things I liked about the movie Lincoln. I'm presuming you've all seen it. But if you'd only ever read about Abraham Lincoln, I don't know that you would have understood before that the fiery side of him, the side that demanded satisfaction. And he demanded satisfaction from the middle states, the border states, although he began first with a tender hand. Lincoln, Dix, John Adams Dix, Henry Halleck, and George McClellan believed at the outset of war two things. One, that the purpose of the war was to keep the Union intact, that it was just a few hothead Southerners who had compelled the others to make this foolish decision to leave the Union, and once they understood the way it really was, they would quickly return to their sensibilities and their loyalties. And two, that that could best be achieved with a conciliatory policy, a hand that gave them much latitude in their decision-making with the expectation that they would return to their loyalties. And Abraham Lincoln selected as the commander of the Middle District, which was at Baltimore and would include the Eastern Shore of Maryland, John Adams Dix. He was a wonderful selection for this position. Dix was a Renaissance man. He was a Cooperstown, New York attorney. He'd held every major post in New York except for governor. He was described even by his enemies as a wonderful facilitator and diplomat. He was well liked. He was the highest ranking volunteer general in this war. So he's a man of some prestige and position, and that was no small position. Many political generals, as they're called, men who didn't have a background in the military, but were persons of import in their communities, were given these political generalships. No one in that category, no one would outrank him for this entire war. And John Dix wanted to be president. So he was very thoughtful about the words that were said about him and the effect he would have on this area of divided loyalties and in the news. And the the Middle District is there in Baltimore. At this point, it's covering most of Maryland, Delaware, the eastern shore of Maryland, and Virginia. Well, those two counties are my two counties are part of Virginia. So they have no oversight except the Confederate forces that are gathering there. Although many generals have their eye on the eastern shore of Virginia, it's the low-hanging fruit. If lost, and worse, if the loss should come farther up to the eastern shore of Maryland, the entire Chesapeake Bay is lost. If lost, the entire blockade may be compromised, as there will always be a spot for European vessels to come and deposit their goods. And as I said, do you trust your neighbor? This is a summer called the Reign of Terror, because neighbors were turning against neighbors immediately. You were urged to express your loyalties, and if they weren't of the right sort or in the right spirit compared to the others in your neighborhood, you could expect much. You could expect ostracism. You could expect perhaps your house to be set afire. You could expect physical violence. If you were a renter and your landlord was of a different loyalty persuasion, you could expect to be put out. It was a terrible time with no real oversight on the shore itself, and things escalating day after day. And as I often tell audiences, our 21st sensibilities, presuming that everyone knew what was happening 24/7, could not be more distant from the real truth of their existence. If you imagine your quietest day on the eastern shore, day after a storm, the power is out, everyone is on vacation, you're the only one in your home, just imagine that quiet moment. And that is the truth. There are few newspapers, they may or may not be accurate, and your information is primarily from your neighbors and what you might learn at the courthouse. And so rumor, speculation are the information superhighway of that day. You would also, the longer you were away from the reality of what was happening, the more you could imagine that the grass was greener on the other side. If you were a unionist, you could imagine that if only the union would come and take care of this, things would be fine. And if you were a secessionist, the longer the war went on, the more you longed for the Confederacy to command the eastern shores. This is a man from Newtown, current-day Pocomoke, who's telling John Dix what is going on the eastern shore of Virginia. And it's true. On the eastern shore of Virginia, some 1,200 Confederate soldiers are gathering and mustering, and they have been ordered by Richmond to prepare to defend that peninsula in case there is an incursion from the north or from the sea. And John Dix gathers 5,000 of his best troops. He calls them the flower of my command. They are the shiniest, brightest, biggest units he can possibly gather together, and he does so because he intends to send them to the eastern shore of Virginia to shock and awe the people into submission. And leading the group will be Durier's 5th New York Zouaves, arguably the most acrobatic, skilled maneuvering unit in all of the United States Army. To lead this expedition into the eastern shore, another sound choice, I believe, is made, and that is the selection of General Henry Hayes Lockwood. Lockwood is a Delmarvan. He is a brilliant mathematician. He's a founding faculty member of the United States Naval Academy. He'd served in the Mexican War. He'd actually served in the Seminole Wars. He was a man who had no ambition, it seems to me, for more for himself than a good job done for his country and colleagues. He did not want to be governor. He did not want to be a politician. He did not at any point have aspirations for the presidency, but he wanted to be a good soldier. He's a balanced man. He's a thoughtful man. And he is, and this is the most attractive thing at the moment to Dix and Lincoln, a slave owner. So the Union general who will expedition to the Eastern Shore is a slave owner. These men gather, coming from primarily the Baltimore area, they gather at Snow Hill and then Pocomoke, anticipating this entree into the Eastern Shore of Virginia. And they have been made imminently aware from General Dix, who's getting it directly from Lincoln, that this is not about a sanguinary conflict. This is about maintaining the peace and bringing the Eastern Shores back into the fold. Those who were secessionists on the Eastern Shore of Maryland as well already becoming very vocal, and several Confederate organizations mustered and drilling on especially the lower Eastern Shore of Maryland. This is actually an image. The next few images I'll show you were done by one of these 5th New York Zouaves on the days about which I'm speaking. Before this expeditionary force went into the Eastern Shore, however, John Adams Dix had sent forward into the Eastern Shore of Virginia a proclamation to the people of Accomack and Northampton. It said, "If you will simply return to your homes and put down your arms, we will not interfere with you or your property." And that was terribly important to many of the secessionist-leaning folks on the Eastern Shore because that included their human property. So Dix sends in this notice, and the force crosses the Maryland line into Virginia. This is literally that moment of the 5th New York Zouaves coming into the Eastern Shore of Virginia. They will go as far as Oak Hall, where they hit the first Confederate fortification, and it's empty. And there they will remain for 5 days because John Dix wants the Confederates on the shore to have some time to think about this whole prospect of conciliation and either return to their homes or have time to get across the bay safely. And that's exactly what happens. Of some 1,000, we have 400 to 500 who will go across the bay, and the others remain on shore, some with this express idea that they will serve the Confederacy right there on shore with guerrilla warfare, irregular warfare, and other sabotaging kinds of activities. Those who went across the bay decided that they could not fight this force of 5,000 gathered at the top of the Eastern Shore of Virginia. They made an agreement, they had a war pact, and they said there will be no dishonor if we manage to cross the bay, regroup, and live to fight another day. But interesting, and this will be a little bit important later on in our discussion this evening, those who remained on the Eastern Shore, those soldiers who had been part of the Confederate forces but chose not to go across the bay to Richmond, were characterized by the Confederate government as prisoners of war and would be paid for their time on the Eastern Shore of Virginia and would be acknowledged for their work there on the Eastern Shore of Virginia on behalf of the Confederacy. Now, this is some November invasion. This is some moment in the lives of everyone on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. And when you think about the lives of individuals who are going through this, I simply, not in any words I can say, not in any documents or pictures I can share with you, can give you the sense of disruption that this was for the folks on these two Eastern Shores, and no more so than in the world of the enslaved. I have numerous accounts of folks who have waited for this moment, waited for these Yankees to come and free them, to come and take them away, and they are literally lined up by the side of the road with, as this photograph suggests, the little worldly goods they have. And some of them, certainly on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, have heard that at Fort Monroe, the Federals give you shelter, that you are defined as as contraband of war, very much like that confiscation issue, and if you can manage to fortress Monroe, you will be free. Well, it will not be so on the eastern shores of Maryland and Virginia. John Dix has determined, A, that there will be no sanctuary in his lines, there will be no sanctuary in his camps, that these soldiers, these Union soldiers, will not be required to return the enslaved who run to them, nor will they be required to go as slave catchers if an owner complains. But the idea here is to continue to curry favor with the Unionist slave owners on both of the shores. And the troops themselves, you know, there's not a set of consistent behaviors among these 5,000 men or the men who will come after them on these two shores. They bring their sensibilities from compassion and care, and yes, some of the Wisconsin soldiers helped 31 enslaved get up to Philadelphia during this adventure. But there were others who made it plain they wanted no part of these people and wanted them not in their camps. And so the end of 1861 closes with the eastern shore of Maryland occupied and the eastern shore of Virginia occupied. Now, did you hear me say that Maryland had seceded from the United States? No. So why is she occupied? Why is the lower eastern shore filled with federal troops? Because Abraham Lincoln wants it this way. Because Abraham Lincoln knows that this is a hotbed of secessionism, and because it's imperative to these commands that the eastern shore of Maryland not affect the eastern shore of Virginia or vice versa. And John Dix is very proud of himself at this time. He feels like he's accomplished exactly what was asked of him, and he writes a beautiful memo on how not a home defaced, not a death by us, that no property has been harmed of any sort. We have accomplished this conciliatory invasion of these areas. And Abraham Lincoln is pleased as well and tells Dix so, and says in his first State of the Union address, as he's describing the control the Union now has on the Chesapeake waters, the counties of Accomack and Northampton, known as the eastern shore of Virginia, together with some contiguous parts of Maryland, that's the eastern shore of Maryland, have laid down their arms, and the people there have renewed their allegiance and accepted the protection of the old flag. And he believes it. And this is a very, very incorrect mission accomplished statement. Nothing really could be farther from the truth. And so the soldiers from Baltimore and elsewhere are sent away, and the eastern shore is repopulated with soldiers from Delmarva Peninsula. So the eastern shore of Maryland and the eastern shore of Virginia are now populated by, presumably, folks like them. And although Henry Hayes Lockwood will remain on paper in command of the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia until the end of 1863, I find that boots on the ground, the one who implements policy, the one who is more likely to discipline, is a man from the lower eastern shore of Maryland, from Crisfield. He's attorney James Wallace. And he, like most of the officers from the eastern shore of Maryland, is a slave owner. Now, Wallace had recruited the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Home Guard. There was also a 2nd regiment, the 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore Home Guard, recruited by a Colonel Wilkins. And these men were recruited with this kind of advertising that expressly says, in bold letters, that you will be stationed on the eastern shore of Maryland. And so later, when the loyalties of these men are questioned by everyone from Henry Lockwood up to Abraham Lincoln, it's important for we who are studying this topic to realize this is the document that they saw. This is the recruitment advertisement. Now, these men were given 3 major tasks. 1, to keep the populations from outright rebellion, to keep those vocal manifestations of disloyalty from influencing the population in toto. 2, to make an effort to stem the ever-rising tide of blockade running. And 3, to guard the telegraph line that ran from Salisbury down the spine of the eastern shore of Virginia and via an underwater cable to Fortress Monroe, which was still in federal hands. The telegraph line, if you've never seen a 19th century one, it's like a telephone line. So imagine something like that going from pole to pole down these remote roads of the Eastern Shore, a very easy target for any saboteur. And then even this cable that went underneath the Chesapeake Bay was in terrible shape. It had been purchased secondhand by the US government when it had failed to go across the Atlantic Ocean, and they were able to get a good price on it. And it too could be fished up with a deep fish hook and snapped. It was the most important line for certainly the first 3 years of this war. And when you see the movie Lincoln, it's this line that he's waiting in the telegraph office for the news of the Eastern Theater of Virginia. Without it, information had to be carried by vessel. Norfolk was by this time still not in federal hands. It made it imperative that the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia be a safe passageway for the telegraph line. And it's during this period of the occupation, the first half of 1862, that we really see the distillation of what civil law and martial law will be on these eastern shores. Because although martial law is briefly declared in Maryland, and for a few interceding times during the war it will be declared again, as a rule, both on the eastern shores of Maryland and Virginia, the civil courts were open and operating. And when the civil courts are open and operating, why would anyone need to be heard by a military court, a military tribunal? And to my mind, this is a conversation we hear almost daily regarding folks who are at Guantanamo, or first who have done allegedly disloyal actions against the United States. Their citizenship is called into question. They may be heard. We've got a case right now going in Boston. They may be heard there in a federal civil court. They may be heard by a military tribunal. But in this operation on the Eastern Shore, as it was, churches were closed, and many of them were occupied by the federal troops, and often the horses of the federal troops. Beautiful old edifices destroyed by this occupation. Newspapers were shut down. You know, on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, you have a number of newspapers that are clearly pro-North or pro-South, and the pro-South ones are closed at various times, or for good. And reading materials were intercepted by the military, materials coming from the north, certainly those that could be intercepted coming from the Western Shore, and your mails were reviewed. The mails ran, and they were reviewed. The oath of allegiance was required. Now, Abraham Lincoln's policy with that was not to demand it at the beginning of the war, not to demand it of every man, but to demand it of those who were in leadership capacities or those in a profession that required a license. His belief then and for a number of years that the populace was easily swayed, and if we could keep these swaying voices silent, the populace would come to its own conclusions. The writ of habeas corpus had been suspended, and military tribunals were used to try disloyals. Civil elections were permitted, both on the eastern shore of Maryland and the eastern shore of Virginia, but always with the presence of the military to, quote, keep order, and in truth, greatly influence the outcome. Now, Henry Hayes Lockwood will tell the folks of the eastern shore of Virginia in the election of 1862, and a special election because you may or may not know this, but not only did the eastern shore of Virginia have a federal representative in Congress, it now being a Union area, but there was throughout this war a loyal government of Virginia, the restored government of Virginia. It was just a skeleton, but it ever existed and was ever treated with by the Lincoln administration. And so elections for these positions and other issues came up early in 1862, and Dix wanted Lockwood to make sure the outcome looked the way it should look to Washington. And so Henry Lockwood did. He told the folks that if they did not vote the way he wanted them to vote, that he had a list of some 400 slaves who'd worked on the fortifications, and that he would, if they didn't vote the way he wanted them to vote, confiscate every one of them and thereby abolish slavery on the eastern shore of Virginia. And as you might guess, the vote went just the way they hoped it would go. The desired outcome was achieved. And it's during this period that Abraham Lincoln weighs in on the arrest of a judge in Talbot County. Judge Richard Carmichael had been pro-secessionist, and there seemed no doubt in the way he believed the federal government should be operating during this difficult time. And he made his opinions known in community, to the newspaper, but he pressed that envelope a bit too far, according to the Lincoln administration, when he made his position known in instructions to the jury examining an arrest case involving civilians and the military. And John Dix was concerned. He sent his concerns to Lincoln, although without outright saying, yes, arrest him. Lincoln knew of it, he permitted it, and Carmichael was arrested and sent to Fort McHenry. John Crisfield interceded on Carmichael's behalf with not only Stanton and Lincoln, but explained that this wasn't looking very good if you were hoping to keep the Unionists of Maryland in the Union. And in a classic Lincoln response, he first writes to Crisfield and gives him his opinion on the judge's instructions to the jury, which he's none too impressed with their loyalty. But he will, in fact write to the judge, he will write to Crisfield, and he and Stanton agree that if the judge will only take the oath of allegiance, he will be released. He doesn't have to revoke what he said. He doesn't have to take any of his writings back. He can continue to make them, really, but he must take the oath of allegiance. This is a classic Lincoln style I see. I will give you something you want, but you must acknowledge the supremacy of the federal government at this time. And whether or not Carmichael took the oath, I'm not sure, but I do know he was not released until 6 months later, and that was on order of Edwin Stanton. A sad thing for the Eastern Shore, it seems to me, was the removal of John Dix, who had done what he was asked to do. The removal of Dix from the Eastern Shore. He was sent to Fortress Monroe. He believed he was being punished by Lincoln, when in fact Lincoln couldn't have been happier with the outcome of this expedition. He was being removed because he was so good as a moderator and facilitator, and George McClellan was about to embark on the Peninsula Campaign and could not abide John Ellis Wool and wanted Wool out, wanted Dix in and Wool out. And so where do you think they sent John Ellis Wool? To the Middle Department in Baltimore to have oversight of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Well, John Ellis Wool, who is the most senior regular Army general, and he's old. He's not going to live much beyond the war. He's born in 1784, and like John Dix, he had met some of the founding fathers, had met Monroe, had met Jefferson. I mean, they'd really been the connection with the Revolutionary War and early national period. And Ellis had no time for his charges on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and Virginia, because he wanted to get out of this war with a fine reputation, and he felt that the politicking in Baltimore from the outset wanted to spread scurrilous rumors, destroy his reputation, and move him out. And so he was completely preoccupied, arguably paranoid about the folks in Baltimore, and he left the Eastern Shores completely to Henry Lockwood's administration. Lockwood Nor did John Ellis Wool, like Henry Lockwood. They simply did not have a good relationship. And when John Ellis Wool first came aboard, Lockwood, who'd been so loyal to Dix and never said a word that was either unkind or undermining him, poured his heart out to Wool, saying that Dix's conciliatory policy is an abject failure, that secessionism is rampant, that there is no disadvantage to verbalizing your pro-South feelings, where Unionists are being just excoriated by their neighbors. And Wool just simply doesn't care. So Lockwood will say, a very uneasy feeling prevails on the eastern shores. And he's not the only one unhappy to be there. Many, many soldiers who've been stationed there on the eastern shores of Maryland and Virginia don't want to be there either. They want to see the elephant. They don't want to be guarding folks they find arrogant and stiff-necked and 100 years behind the time, and ugly women even, say they. They want no part of it. That's most of the soldiers who are on the eastern shore. But the one time that Wool seems to care about what's happening on this shore is when those members of the 1st and 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore regiments refuse to go beyond the borders of the eastern shore of Maryland, and he considers them to be in a state of mutiny. And we have no fewer than 5 times where that will occur. The most famous one is one about which Bryce did a wonderful article, and Kim Baynard has a book, A Year in Company A. It's Company A which refuses to go, many members of which refuse to obey a command to go and help with a situation in Drummondtown. And for that, the entire company is summarily discharged. As fascinating as that one is, and as much as I believe we'll truly get to the bottom of exactly what happened, we're still looking for the smoking gun on that case. I think a far more interesting situation is in October of '62, when 4 companies of the 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore refused to disembark at Pungateague Creek and literally stay on the vessel for days. Lockwood does not know what to do. He calls in the Navy. He contacts General Wool, what shall I do? The commander of the 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore at that point, at that place, was a man from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, Robert Smith Rogers. He's a scion of the community. He's the child of and father of great admirals. His brother-in-law is Commander Perry. He has to do something, and he doesn't know what to do. And literally for days, they are trying to cajole these 4 companies off. Finally, Wool says, I'm coming over. You get the artillery up there, and the Richmond paper will report that they are scalded off. That's the only account I have found. But I do know that most of the men came off and did serve, and those who did not, like Company A, were summarily discharged. At the end of 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation is drafted. The 2 Eastern Shore counties will be exempted. Maryland and Eastern Shore of Virginia counties, Maryland and Delaware, of course, are not included, having stayed in the Union. And a new commander, again, is brought with a much harder hand. With each succeeding commander of these Eastern Shores, a harder and harder hand is brought to bear as Lincoln sees conciliation is not working, slavery is not ending quickly nor on its own, and that this war is going on far longer than expected. And as Robert E. Lee advances northward in 1863, nearly all of the shore soldiers move out westward to fight either in Baltimore, environs, or in what is Gettysburg, and many of them fight at Culp's Hill. The 1st Maryland Eastern Shore will literally fight against the 1st Maryland Confederacy. And Wallace will say, the 1st Maryland Confederate Regiment met us, we were cut to pieces, we sorrowfully gathered up many of our old friends and acquaintances and had them carefully and tenderly cared for. And I want you to know that those who come back to the Eastern Shore of Maryland and Virginia will never be the same. they bring with them a very different attitude. They will not abide the slightest effect of disloyalty or irreverence. They have had it. They've seen their colleagues die, and these folks over whom they believe the war has passed so lightly will feel anew what General Robert Skank says, and that's really how you say his name, it's Skank. They teased him and called him General Skunk, but he was General Robert Skank. He said, they are going to feel the smack now, the smack of our hand. While they were gone, however, another adventure began on both shores, and that was the recruitment at the insistence of General Robert Skank, and with only the vaguest approvals of Lincoln and Stanton. Recruitment for the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, began on the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia. On the eastern shore of Maryland, led by General William Birney, who recruited for both the 7th and the 9th, and also on the eastern shore of Maryland and the eastern shore of Virginia, a Colonel Nelson. And my friends, they competed against each other. Birney was clever. He would go to plantations, he would go to jails, he would go to the poorhouse. Nelson was corrupt. He would have his officers literally impress gentlemen as they were walking down the road on the way to church, or if they were out oystering. And together, the two of them competed for the highest number of soldiers, and sadly, even stole soldiers from each other. I mean, one unit would go and round up a group of men and bring them back, and for this, Nelson will literally be kicked out of the army. Something else is happening, and that is those who still, this is 1863, the eastern shore of Virginia still permits slavery, and so does the eastern shore of Maryland. And there are many folks who are coming from the western shore and slave stealing to take the enslaved over to the western shore, so they will not be recruited, so they will not run away. And I want you to think about what this recruiting might have meant to the Union slaveholders who thought that the exemption from the Emancipation Proclamation was to curry favor with them, to support them, to give them some hope that the federal government was still listening to their concerns about their slave property. But when Lincoln permits these recruiters to come in and steal the slaves right out from under them, quote unquote, they're not so sure where this all will lead. And really, most among them, Colonel James Wallace himself, he is not abiding this recruitment. When USCT potential soldiers present themselves to him in Salisbury, he sends them home. When others bring groups of gentlemen who want to serve, he sends them away. He makes a number of public statements expressing his dissatisfaction with this whole arrangement, including the statement that, while I stay here and fight the Union, my own farm has failed, my servants have all departed, and I'm ruined. I'm ruined standing up for the United States government. I'm ruined in community. I'm ruined in my neighborhood where most folks are secessionists, and he will resign from the United States Army. But the real end of this conciliation policy comes at the end of 1863, when Confederate raider John Bell comes from the western shore and attacks the federal lighthouses on Cape Charles. There's one that's in existence, there's one that's being constructed, and he just brilliantly surprises, overwhelms all of the residents of the area and takes everything he can possibly take in all the vessels he can gather up. Very valuable New Bedford whale oil, very valuable apparatus that supports the lighthouses, and he manages back to Richmond. Well, Stanton and Lincoln think the folks of the eastern shore of Virginia are culpable in this. They believe they've helped Bell, and if they didn't directly help him, they knew about this raid and said nothing. And they will be ordered to pay for the reconstruction of the lighthouse, and in fact for a wish list of things that the United States government wants. The Eastern Shore has a federal congressman, and he steps in and says, no, you're misunderstanding. The folks of my district are loyal. They've always been loyal. They love you. They've never not thought you were wonderful. They're glad for your leadership. Well, of course, if they're not, this fellow has no job, Joseph Cigar. And Lincoln again believes Cigar because he's believed him many times before, and he suspends the collection. He says, okay, maybe I'm misunderstanding the situation. But a federal officer named Hayner, Major Hayner, goes and investigates the whole situation. And he comes back with no good opinion of the shore and believed that Union men on the Eastern Shore of Virginia were like angel visits, very few and far between. They're deadly hostile to the government and especially this administration, and madly devoted to the insane rebellious war waged against the United States. Lincoln reads this 30-page excoriating report aloud in Hayner's presence, and he tells Joseph Cigar that we are not returning a penny of the collected money unless it appears that my act in this case has been accepted in the right spirit, because now Lincoln realizes that the people were jubilant over my decision, but they saw it as a victory over the government extorted by fear. And in this moment, I see Abraham Lincoln, his spirit, as far as these two areas, completely break. He understands that he has been duped. And Hayner's report is so specific with names, places, times, and events that he cannot help but conclude there is little loyalty on these two shores. And something similar happens in the Eastern Shore of Maryland in November of 1863. General Schenck has issued an order number 53, which said, yes, we're going to have a congressional election this fall, but all of the polls will be manned by the military, and they will intervene if anything seems disloyal, and if anyone presents themselves that they know to be disloyal. Now, the governor of Maryland heard about that and protested to Lincoln, and Lincoln modified Schenck's order somewhat. He did interfere, but he didn't really. He still gave the military the permission to be present and control the election. And in this particular election, in Salisbury, we have two powerhouses against each other. John Cresswell and Mr. Crisfield are going for the same congressional seat. Crisfield has been loath to join any movement toward emancipation. Cresswell supports it, and in part because by now the Enrollment Act has been passed, and they need bodies, they need men, and African American bodies could fill a draft quota or be hired as a substitute. And so this is one of the major issues at this election. The military does interfere, and arguably, by their behavior and the people they would not permit to vote, and again, they could tell who was voting by the polling pieces, the election goes to Cresswell, and Crisfield, who was the incumbent, writes to Montgomery Blair and also writes to Abraham Lincoln and tells them both that this is a great denial of justice, that the United States military should permit my congressional seat to be taken from me. And Lincoln writes back, and he expresses, again, classic Lincoln, he expresses his concern, but he does not revoke this election. Instead, he promises Crisfield that he'll have the officer who was most responsible for this disruption brought before a court-martial. And this is Lincoln's own little annotation at the top saying as much. And when the officer, who feels like he's just been doing what he was ordered to do, finds out he's going to be arrested for this, he says, you tell Captain, you're seeing it already, you tell Captain Moore to tell Colonel Cheeseborough to, because I'm in command. And so we see this perpetual dynamic between the military and the civil government. And Schenck has had it with Lincoln by this time. And I'm nearing my conclusion to tell you that Schenck finds that Abraham Lincoln has undermined him once too often. He will apply the hard hand he believes he's been told to apply to scourge the natives, to keep them all in line, only to have Lincoln release the person, or only to have Lincoln countermand the order, or only to have Lincoln be influenced by someone else to modify what he has determined. And one of them is, remember the 400 Confederates who stay on the eastern shore of Virginia and don't go across the bay? Well, Schenck thinks they're being troublemakers and wants them all to take an oath. They've never had to take an oath of allegiance. They simply had to put their arms down. And when Lincoln hears about that, he says, oh, no, you can't change terms in the middle of the war. These people have already made their peace with the United States. And Schenck is about to pull his hair out, and when a very obvious case of disloyalty presents itself, and Schenck says, I know that these folks should be sent to Fort Monroe, but he doesn't, because as he writes to Stanton, I have no longer any assurance that my policy would be sustained. To make such orders and then have the president interfere, suspend, or set them aside has a worse influence than to let such acts go unnoticed and unpunished. And Schenck will leave to join the United States Congress, where he's won a seat. And Lincoln justifies his philosophy. The military arrests and detentions which have been made have been for the prevention and not for the punishment, as injunctions to stay injury, as proceedings to keep the peace. But he's been made more aware than he cares to admit that his policy of conciliation has brought him great criticism from within his own Republican Party, that they want someone with a very hard hand like Benjamin Butler, and they don't want this mamby-pambying because the war is going to go on. It is not going to end in the year of 1863, and it doesn't look like it's going to end in 64. And so Lincoln brings to the eastern shore of Maryland General Lew Wallace, who's come from Indiana, and he had an episode at Shiloh where he was a scapegoat and where his decision-making came under question from Grant. And so he comes to the eastern shore of Maryland, and to the command of the Middle Department, with something to prove. And when he gets there, he finds the eastern shore in such a state of disloyalty that he wants to proclaim martial law and asks Lincoln if he can. And for the eastern shore of Virginia, that very disloyal place now in Lincoln's mind, he will literally rip it away from the Middle District and give it to the new commander of the District of Virginia and North Carolina, and that is Benjamin Beast Butler. There is no harder hand. There is no harder hand that is known as far as an administrative general. Butler routinely oversteps his authority, as he'd done in New Orleans. Any of you know about the Woman's Order, where he'd insisted that women be respectful or they would be arrested as women plying their avocation as prostitutes. About to bring all of that to the eastern shore of Virginia, until Lincoln learns that Butler has overstepped his authority a little too much and is looking to declare martial law on the eastern shore of Virginia without Lincoln's permission. And that, and a few other ill-chosen steps, will mean the end for Benjamin Butler. The year of 1864 is a year of women, and that's what I'll be talking about very much this whole year. These have been hard times for the women, and the women are weary of being left alone to fend for themselves with an ever-changing occupying force. And I was going to tell you a little bit about Clara Gunby, but I'll let you look at the exhibit over at the Nabb Center about her. She would not walk under the United States flag hanging outside the hotel in Salisbury. And when the federal officers came to her home and insisted she put the flag up, she said, well, you can, but I'm going to fly a Confederate flag higher than that one. And if you put a flag over every window, I would just crawl out, not to be having to go under that flag. She will be sent to Fort McHenry and tried for disloyalty, and has a wonderful adventure, a wonderful documented in her diary adventure, where she will be influenced by some folks from the Confederacy and conclude her time in the war as a Confederate spy. And on the eastern shore of Virginia, every woman 16 and older must now take the oath of allegiance that had not been required. And women of this room, would you, it's now 1864, you're sick of this war, would you take that oath? Would you? Had you had the opportunity to vote for it? Had you had the opportunity to have your voice heard in the public square about this war and all of its manifestations and meanings for you? You had not. And so told Mary Graves to the new commander on the shore. And he said, you're all traitors. You've all been doing all sorts of treasonous acts. And so by your very behaviors, you have rendered yourself liable to treason, and you must take the oath of allegiance. Some women submitted, like Ann Tom. She had been on the shore since the outset of war, and the only reason she remained was to keep and protect her property. And now, although she was longing to go to Richmond, where her husband was a surgeon, she submitted, remembering even the Blessed Savior paid tribute to a despotic government. Other women on the shore would not, including 35 women in the Onancock area who would not take the oath of allegiance, and in August of '64, and I want you to think about this August this year, what it feels like in the summertime, they were literally arrested in their homes and kept in their bedrooms until they would take the oath of allegiance in August. So what will 1865, Reconstruction, the Supreme Court decisions mean to Lincoln's legacy and loyalty? What will it mean? Well, you're going to have to ask me back because we're out of time and I'm out of stories for the evening. But between now and then, I challenge you to look right here in the Nabb Center, in your own local newspapers that are online, in your families, in community. I challenge you to find these stories because I didn't even touch the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg of what happened here. And these are stories waiting to be told about people who are people just like you and me. And with that, I thank you, and I'll take your questions.
Anyone have a question?
The question is there a list of the women who signed the oath? Yes, there is. It's in the National Archives. There are multi-volumes of oath signers from the Eastern Shore of Virginia and from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. How do we distinguish what's in the National Archives from what goes to the Library of Congress? The National Archives is the repository for the records of federal agencies, rarely the repository for the personal papers of individuals. So many of the things I'm showing you are from the United States District Courts, a federal agency, where the papers of Benjamin Butler are at the Library of Congress. The National Archives would not likely take it on. It's very important to know, too, when you are frustrated in your research, there was no National Archives until 1934. So I marvel that we have as much as we have. And with this just plethora of new materials coming online, research is a whole new adventure. It's magnificent, just magnificent. And I thank you for the patience you've expressed. There's a lot to cover, and I hope you enjoyed it.